The grand chamber of the Celestial Accord orbital station hung in silent orbit above the gas giant Velos, a jewel of diplomacy built over 2 centuries by dozens of starfaring civilizations. Its walls shimmered with living crystal that pulsed gently in response to mood and tone, casting soft ripples of blue and violet across the curved floor. Delegates from 17 species filled the concentric rings of the amphitheater-style room, some seated, some hovering, others standing on articulated limbs or coiled tails. The air smelled faintly of ozone and alien incense, a blend meant to calm nerves and encourage honesty. At the center dais, the Velnari emissary finished his opening address. His voice, translated through the universal comm beads worn by all attendees, carried a practiced calm that barely masked the tension beneath. He spoke of shared futures, of mutual restraint, of the need to end the border skirmishes between his people and the Qatari collective before they spiraled into full war. His words were polished, rehearsed, and utterly hollow. Watching from the human delegation section, Captain Daniel Hayes shifted in his seat. He was a lean man in his late 30s with close-cropped brown hair and eyes that had seen too many battles fought under false flags. Beside him sat Ambassador Lisa Monroe, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She had spent the last 6 months preparing for this summit, smoothing over old grievances, building trust with species who barely understood human concepts like forgiveness or second chances. Behind them stood Fleet Liaison Carl Brooks, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had read the same intelligence reports Daniel had. The reports showed something the Velnari and Qatari had carefully hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Weeks before the summit even began, secret envoys from both sides had met in the dead zone near the Helios Rift. There they had signed a private accord, not for peace, but for division. They planned to carve up neutral systems like Orlan Prime and the Viridian Belt, splitting resources and influence while pretending to seek harmony in front of the galactic community. The peace talks were never meant to stop a war. They were meant to disguise one already underway. Daniel had argued for days about what to do. Carl wanted to confront them quietly, behind closed doors, give them a chance to back down. Lisa believed exposure would only fracture the fragile unity holding the accord together. But Daniel remembered Earth's own past. Treaties signed with smiles while armies marched in the dark. He remembered how silence had cost millions their lives. He could not sit and nod while history repeated itself on a galactic scale. As the Velnari emissary stepped back, bowing slightly to the assembly, the chamber waited for the human response. It was tradition. After the opening statements, the neutral mediator, this time humanity, would offer words of balance, of hope, of shared purpose. All eyes turned to the Terran delegation. Instead of rising with a prepared speech, Daniel stood slowly, his boots clicking softly against the smooth floor. He did not walk to the dais. He simply faced the room, hands at his sides, and spoke into the quiet. "Thank you for your words," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But humanity will not mediate a peace built on lies." A ripple of confusion passed through the chamber. The translator bead struggled for a moment, as if unsure how to render such a blunt phrase into the nuanced dialects of a dozen species. Then the meaning sank in. Before any of the alien delegates could react, before the Velnari could protest or the Qatari could feign innocence, Daniel turned. He gave a single nod to Lisa and Carl. Without another word, the 3 humans walked out of the chamber, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Behind them, the living walls of the chamber dimmed to a deep, troubled red. Outside, in the corridor leading to the human shuttle bay, Carl finally broke the quiet. "That was reckless," he muttered, keeping pace with Daniel's long strides. "We just burned every bridge we spent years building." "Bridges built on sand don't hold weight," Daniel replied without slowing. "Better they collapse now than when lives depend on them." Lisa walked between them, her face still composed, but her fingers trembled slightly at her sides. "They'll call us arrogant," she said softly. "Ungrateful. Unfit for the galactic stage." "Let them," Daniel said. "If the galactic stage only welcomes liars and actors, then maybe we don't belong there." The shuttle awaited them, its hatch open, engines humming in standby. As they boarded, the station's internal comm crackled to life. A voice, human from the Terran liaison office, spoke with urgency. "Captain Hayes, Ambassador Monroe, you're being summoned back by the Accord Council." "They're calling an emergency session." Daniel paused at the threshold of the shuttle. He looked back down the corridor toward the sealed doors of the grand chamber. Somewhere behind those doors, powerful beings were scrambling to contain the fallout, to spin the narrative, to paint humanity as the disruptor rather than the truth-teller. "No," he said into his comm. "Tell them we're done talking while others whisper in the dark." He stepped inside. The hatch closed behind him with a soft hiss. Back in the chamber, chaos had finally erupted. The Velnari delegate demanded an explanation. The Qatari envoy denied any wrongdoing. A small reptilian species from the outer rim stood up and asked simply, "What lies?" That question spread like fire through the assembly. Whispers turned to shouts. Accusations flew. The fragile illusion of unity cracked under the weight of one human's refusal to play along. News of the walkout traveled faster than light. Within hours, every major news feed across the galaxy carried the same headline, translated into hundreds of languages. Humans abandon peace summit. Reactions varied wildly. On Earth, citizens gathered in public squares, some cheering, others fearful. In the Velnari capital, state media branded humanity as ungrateful barbarians who had insulted centuries of diplomatic tradition. On neutral trade worlds, however, a different sentiment grew. Curiosity, respect, even hope aboard the shuttle. As it detached from the station and arced toward the waiting Terran cruiser, Aurora's resolve, Lisa finally let her mask slip. She leaned against the viewport, watching the orbital station shrink behind them. "What do we do now?" she asked, not looking at either man. Daniel sat in the pilot's seat, hands resting lightly on the controls. "We wait," he said, "and we see who values truth more than comfort." Carl exhaled sharply. "And if no one does?" "Then we stand alone," Daniel replied. "But at least we'll be standing on solid ground." The cruiser's hangar bay opened to receive them, its lights warm against the cold black of space. As the shuttle settled onto the deck, crew members stood at attention, not out of protocol but out of something deeper. They had seen the broadcast. They knew what their leaders had done. In that moment, humanity had not gained allies or territory or treaties. But they had done something rarer in the galaxy. They had chosen honesty over convenience. And in a universe full of polished words and hidden daggers, that choice would echo far longer than any speech ever could. News of humanity's sudden exit from the Celestial Accord Summit spread through the galaxy like a shockwave. Within hours, every major newsfeed, from the crystalline broadcasts of the Xylos Ring to the scent-based bulletins of the Gormati hives, carried the same core message: humans had walked away. Some called it an act of supreme arrogance. Others whispered it was the first honest moment the galaxy had seen in decades. On Earth, people gathered in city squares, cafes, and orbital habitats, watching replays of Captain Daniel Hayes' quiet exit. Reactions were split. In New Chicago, crowds cheered, waving flags and shouting that humanity had finally shown backbone. In the coastal districts of Old San Diego, others worried aloud that Earth had just made powerful enemies at the worst possible time. Aboard the orbital defense platform, Aurora's Resolve, tension hung thick in the recycled air. The ship floated in high geosynchronous orbit, its hull scarred from past skirmishes but its systems humming with readiness. Inside the strategy room, Lisa Monroe sat at the head of the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a data pad. On it were intercepted comm logs, energy signatures, and encrypted messages pulled from deep space relays. The evidence was overwhelming. Weeks before the summit, Velnari and Qatari vessels had met near the Helios Rift, a region officially declared neutral and off-limits. There they had exchanged coordinates, resource quotas, and military timetables. They were not preparing for peace. They were planning a quiet conquest of weaker systems, using the summit as cover to lull the galaxy into complacency. Carl Brooks paced near the viewport, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "We should have stayed," he said for the third time that hour. "We could have used the evidence to force them into real talks. Now they'll just deny everything and blame us for the collapse." Lisa didn't look up. They would have twisted the truth anyway. You know how their councils work. Endless debate, secret backroom deals, public denials. By the time we proved anything, Orlan Prime would already be under occupation. Daniel stood by the far wall, silent until now. He had spent the last 2 days reviewing every line of the intercepted data, cross-referencing it with civilian traffic logs and refugee reports. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly. They're not just dividing territory. They're sharing intelligence on species that refuse to pick sides. The Sithari, the Zin, even the Orlanis. They're all marked as non-compliant. That's code for expendable. A heavy silence settled over the room. The Sithari were a peaceful insectoid people who lived on floating bio-islands in the methane seas of Viridia 9. The Zin communicated through bioluminescent pulses and had no concept of war. The Orlanis had spent centuries building a culture of neutrality, offering sanctuary to refugees from every conflict. None of them had fleets or weapons. None of them stood a chance. Back on Earth, the United Terran Alliance government convened an emergency session. Some ministers urged immediate outreach to the Velnari and Qatari, begging for reconciliation. Others pushed for full military readiness, fearing retaliation. But public opinion was shifting. Across social networks, a new phrase began trending: walk like haze. It wasn't just about defiance, it was about refusing to pretend. School children wrote essays about integrity. Artists painted murals of humans turning their backs on golden thrones. Even old veterans, scarred by Earth's own wars of deception, nodded in quiet approval. Meanwhile, strange messages began arriving at Terran outposts. Not from major powers, but from the fringes. A Sithari elder sent a woven data thread containing a song of gratitude. A Zin envoy traveling in a tiny organic pod requested docking clearance at Luna Station just to see human eyes that speak truth. On the ice mining colony of Viridia 9, engineer Paul Dawson found himself working side by side with a group of Sithari refugees who had fled their homeworld after Velnari scouts were spotted nearby. They didn't speak the same language, but they shared tools, heat packs, and meals. Paul taught them how to repair fusion couplings. They showed him how to grow edible lichen in sub-zero air. No treaties, no speeches, just people helping people. Lisa watched these developments from orbit, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew the big powers wouldn't change overnight. The Velnari had already released a statement calling humanity emotionally immature and unfit for galactic discourse. The Qatari accused Earth of sabotaging peace for selfish gain. Trade routes once open to human freighters were suddenly under review. Several mid-tier species quietly suspended diplomatic ties, fearing guilt by association. But something else was happening too. Minor species, those long ignored by the Accord, began reaching out directly to human settlements. Not through formal channels, but through personal messages, shared frequencies, even old-fashioned radio bursts. They weren't asking for protection. They were asking for partnership. They wanted to know, if humans valued truth, could they be trusted to stand by others who did the same? Daniel received one such message while reviewing patrol routes near the Kuiper Belt. It came from a small mining collective on the edge of Qatari space. The sender, a woman named Mara from the asteroid settlement of Helios 7, wrote, "We saw what you did. We're scared too, but we'd rather be scared with you than safe with liars." He read it 3 times before saving it to a private folder. Carl, still skeptical, argued that these gestures meant little without firepower or political weight. "Kind words won't stop a fleet," he said during a late-night briefing. "Maybe not," Daniel replied. "But they build something stronger than fleets. They build trust." Weeks passed. The galaxy held its breath. The Velnari and Qatari, embarrassed by the fallout, doubled down on their narrative. They held a joint press conference, smiling as they pledged to continue peace efforts, without the disruptive influence of emotional species like humans. But cracks were forming. A Velnari trade envoy was caught leaking documents to a neutral news outlet. A Qatari general resigned, citing moral fatigue. On 3 different worlds, citizens held silent vigils holding signs that read, "Truth first." Back on the Aurora's resolve, Lisa made a decision. She authorized low-profile aid missions to vulnerable systems, not as military operations, but as humanitarian efforts. Medical supplies, engineers, teachers, no weapons, no uniforms, just help offered quietly without fanfare. When asked why, she simply said, "If we're going to stand for something, let it be kindness as much as courage." Daniel approved the plan. He knew the big war hadn't started yet, but the real battle, the one for the soul of the galaxy, was already underway. And for the first time, humanity wasn't trying to win favor. They were trying to earn respect. As the Aurora's resolve powered up for its next patrol, Daniel looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, small acts of honesty were multiplying. And in a universe built on grand illusions, even the smallest truth could become a revolution. The weeks after humanity's walkout turned into months and the galaxy settled into a strange new rhythm. Official channels grew cold toward Earth. Trade ships that once docked freely at Terran ports now required triple clearance. Diplomatic requests went unanswered. The Velnari and Qatari painted humanity as reckless children who had shattered the peace for no good reason. Their message was clear: cooperate with the established order or be left behind. Yet in the quiet corners of space, far from the grand chambers and polished speeches, something different was growing. On the ice mining colony of Viridia 9, engineer Paul Dawson stood in a makeshift workshop carved into a glacier, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Around him, Sithari refugees worked alongside human technicians, their many-jointed limbs moving with surprising grace as they rewired an old cargo hauler. The ship had once carried ore. Now it would carry medicine and warm clothing to outlying settlements cut off by the new trade restrictions. Paul didn't speak Sithari, and they didn't speak English, but they had learned to understand each other through gestures, shared tools, and the universal language of fixing things that were broken. One of the Sithari, a young worker named Cree, had shown Paul how to seal hull breaches using a resin made from native fungi. In return, Paul taught them how to recalibrate fusion cores without triggering a shutdown. No contracts were signed. No credits changed hands. They simply helped each other survive. Back on Earth, in a classroom on the edge of New Denver, teacher Maria Lopez stood before a group of teenagers, her screen displaying a live feed from Luna Station. On it, a Zin delegate pulsed soft patterns of blue and green light against a dark backdrop. The students watched, rapt, as Maria explained how the Zin used light to tell stories. Stories of loss, of hope, of stars they had watched for generations. One student raised a hand. "Do they know we walked out of the summit?" Maria nodded. "They say it made their elders weep," she replied. Not from sadness, but because they thought no one in power ever told the truth anymore. These small moments multiplied. On Mars, a group of human botanists shared drought-resistant seed strains with a delegation of plant-based beings from the Eos Nebula. On a derelict freighter-turned-refugee shelter near the Helios Belt, a retired Terran medic named Frank Torres treated wounded Qatari deserters who had refused orders to occupy neutral worlds. He didn't ask why they left. He just cleaned their wounds and offered them a bunk. None of this made the headlines on major galactic networks. The Velnari state media still called humans unstable. The Qatari Trade Council still listed Earth as non-compliant. But in the underground comms channels, in the whispers between freighter captains, in the quiet exchanges at border markets, a new idea was taking root. People began to speak of the human standard, not as a measure of power but of honesty. If a promise came from a human, it could be trusted. If a human said no, they meant it. If they walked away, there was a reason. This shift did not go unnoticed. On the Aurora's resolve, intelligence reports started showing unusual patterns. Minor species that had once stayed silent during Accord votes were now asking pointed questions. A council of asteroid dwellers from the Rim territories publicly questioned why the Velnari fleet was stationed near Orlan Prime if peace talks were still ongoing. A coalition of aquatic traders from the Nymar expanse halted shipments to Qatari ports, citing ethical concerns. None of them mentioned humanity directly, but the timing was no coincidence. Carl Brooks, still wary but less certain of his earlier doubts, reviewed the data with Lisa Monroe in the ship's quiet observation lounge. "They're testing the waters," he said, tapping a screen showing a spike in encrypted messages between fringe worlds. "They want to see if we'll back them up." Lisa sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "We're not backing anyone up with guns, but we're showing them they're not alone." Down on Earth, public opinion had shifted again. The initial fear of isolation had given way to a quiet pride. People weren't celebrating war or victory. They were celebrating integrity. Murals appeared on city walls showing humans and aliens working side by side. Musicians wrote songs about truth being heavier than steel. Even children's cartoons featured characters who chose honesty over easy answers. But the cost was real. Human freighters faced delays, inspections, and sometimes outright denial at major ports. Some colonies reported shortages of rare minerals once easily traded. Families worried about the future. Yet when asked if they regretted the walkout, most simply shook their heads. Better to stand tall with less, one dock worker in New Singapore told a reporter, than bow low with everything. Daniel Hayes spent less time in meetings and more time visiting outposts. He walked the corridors of refugee ships, sat in mess halls with engineers and medics, listened to stories from people who had lost homes, but not hope. He didn't give speeches. He just listened. And in doing so, he learned what humanity truly offered the galaxy. Not weapons or wealth, but the simple courage to say what is real. One evening, aboard a supply vessel heading to Viridia 9, Daniel received a message from an unexpected source. It was from a low-ranking Velnari clerk who had accessed internal fleet logs. The message was short. They move on Orlan Prime in 7 cycles. Tell the truth again. There was no name, no signature. Just a warning, sent at great personal risk. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he forwarded it to Lisa and Carl with a single line. It's starting. He looked out the viewport at the endless stars. Somewhere out there, a small world was about to be swallowed by lies, and this time, humanity wouldn't be alone in speaking up. The price of principle had been high, but it had bought something priceless. Trust. And in the coming storm, trust would be the only shield that mattered. The warning came true faster than anyone expected. Just 6 cycles after the anonymous Velnari message, sensor buoys near Orlan Prime lit up with the telltale signatures of a joint fleet. Velnari warships flanked by Qatari support vessels, moving under the cover of a solar flare. Their official broadcast claimed they were conducting humanitarian patrols to ensure stability in the region. But everyone knew what that meant. Orlan Prime had no army, no weapons, only farms, schools, and a council of elders who believed in open borders and shared knowledge. It was defenseless. News of the fleet movement spread through the fringe networks before the major galactic channels even acknowledged it. On Viridia 9, Paul Dawson dropped his wrench and stared at the emergency alert flashing on his wristcom. On Luna Station, Maria Lopez gathered her students and turned off the lesson feed. In the quiet corridors of the Aurora's Resolve, Daniel Hayes stood over a star map, his face grim. Lisa Monroe entered without knocking, her eyes already on the same data stream. They're doing it, she said softly. Daniel nodded, and the Accord is silent. Indeed, the Celestial Accord Council had issued a vague statement urging all parties to exercise restraint, but took no action. The big powers were watching, waiting to see who would blink first. But this time someone else stepped forward. Within hours, a dozen small ships, freighters, medical shuttles, even converted mining rigs, began converging on the Orlan system. They flew no official flags, carried no weapons, but formed a loose perimeter around the planet. At their lead was a battered cargo hauler from the Rim territories, its hull patched with mismatched plates. Its captain, a grizzled human named Ed Walsh, who had once run spice routes through pirate zones, opened a public channel. "We are here as witnesses," he said, his voice rough but steady. "If you move on Orlan Prime, the whole galaxy will see it." Then others joined. A Sithari biobarge drifted into position, its organic hull glowing faintly. A Zin light sail shimmered into view, pulsing a steady amber rhythm, ancient code for truth is watching. Ships from the Nymar Expanse, the Eos Nebula, even a lone vessel crewed by deserters from the Qatari border guard, all took their places. They did not threaten, they simply stood, and behind them quietly, the United Terran Alliance activated its deep-range comms array. Not to send threats, but to broadcast everything. Every ship movement, every transmission, every lie the Velnari and Qatari tried to spin. The feed went out on open channels, unencrypted, free for anyone to see. Daniel had given the order himself. "Let them lie," he said, "but let everyone hear the truth behind it." The Velnari fleet hesitated. Their commanders had expected silence, maybe a weak protest from the Accord. They had not expected a wall of witnesses, human and alien alike, standing shoulder to shoulder without firing a shot. For 2 full days the standoff held. Then something remarkable happened. A Velnari cruiser peeled off from the main group and powered down its weapons. Its captain, a veteran named Talor, who had lost family in past border wars, sent a private message to Ed Walsh. "Tell the humans," it read, "we remember what honor looks like." More ships followed. Not all, but enough. The joint fleet began to fracture. The Qatari command tried to press forward alone. But their support vessels refused orders. Back on their homeworld, citizens took to the streets. Protests erupted outside government spires. The lie was unraveling in real time. On Mars, in a newly built hall of diplomacy, Lisa Monroe stood before a gathering of representatives from 23 minor species. They had come not for treaties but for a promise. "We don't need your weapons," said a moss-skinned delegate from the Eos Nebula. "We need your voice. When the big ones speak lies, you must speak truth." Lisa looked around the room, at the insectoid Sthari, the luminous Zin, the armored miners from the Rim. "We won't speak for you," she said. "But we'll stand with you when you speak for yourselves." Meanwhile, Daniel prepared to address the galaxy, not from a grand chamber, not in a polished uniform, but from the bridge of a medical frigate orbiting a moon scarred by old battles. The ship, the Mercy Wing, had just finished evacuating civilians from a skirmish zone near the Helios Rift. Its hull was dented, its paint faded, but its mission was clear. He stood before a simple camera. No backdrop, no script. "We don't seek to lead," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We seek to stand beside those who value truth as much as survival. If your word means something, if your home matters, if your children deserve a future built on honesty, then you are not alone." The speech lasted less than 3 minutes, but it spread faster than any military broadcast ever could. Across thousands of worlds, in homes and ships and hidden comm stations, people listened, and for the first time in generations, they believed someone in power was telling the truth. Back on Orlan Prime, the elders opened their comm channels to the watching fleet. An old woman named Yara, her face lined with centuries of peace, spoke directly to the Velnari and Qatari commanders. "You may take our land," she said, "but you cannot take our memory, and we will remember who stood with us and who stood against us." The words hit harder than any missile. Within hours, the remaining Velnari and Qatari ships withdrew, not in defeat but in shame. In the aftermath, the galaxy changed, not with explosions but with choices. Minor species formed new alliances, not based on strength, but on shared values. Trade routes shifted away from the old powers toward networks built on trust. And humanity, once seen as reckless outsiders, became something else entirely, a quiet anchor in a sea of shifting loyalties. Daniel returned to the Aurora's resolve. Not as a hero, but as a man who had simply done what felt right. As the ship turned toward Earth, he looked out at the stars and thought of all the small acts that had led to this moment. A shared meal on an ice world, a story told in light, a warning sent in secret. None of it had seemed like much at the time. But together they had moved the galaxy, and the real work was just beginning. A year after humans walked out of the Celestial Accord Summit, the galaxy looked different, not because of battles won or empires fallen, but because something quieter had taken root: trust. The old order, built on polished words and hidden deals, had crumbled under its own weight. In its place rose something new, not perfect but honest. It began not with a declaration, but with a handshake between a human engineer and a Sithari elder on a frozen moon. It grew with every shared meal, every open channel, every time someone chose truth over comfort. The signing of the Compact of Shared Integrity took place on Mars, in a simple dome built over an old greenhouse. There were no golden thrones, no holographic banners, no grand orchestras, just a circle of chairs made from recycled ship parts, arranged around a smooth stone brought from Earth's oldest peace garden. Representatives from 32 species sat together, some with legs, some with fins, some with roots that curled gently into the soil beneath the floor. At the center stood Lisa Monroe, her hair streaked with gray now, her eyes calm but bright. She did not speak as a leader but as a witness. "We are not here to rule," she said, her voice carrying softly through the dome. "We are here to remember. To remember that words mean nothing if actions do not follow. That peace is not the absence of conflict but the presence of fairness. That no voice is too small to matter." One by one, each delegate placed their hand, or claw, or tendril, or light-emitting node on the stone. There was no ink, no digital signature. The act itself was the promise. When it was over, no one cheered. They simply stood in silence, looking at each other not as rivals or subjects, but as neighbors. Daniel Hayes watched from the edge of the dome, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. He had not been asked to sign. He had not wanted to. This was not humanity's treaty to claim. It belonged to everyone who had risked something to speak plainly in a universe full of whispers. He remembered the fear in the early days, the trade bans, the isolation, the voices calling them fools. Now those same voices were asking how to join the compact. Back on Earth, life had changed in subtle ways. Children learned alien languages not for trade, but for friendship. Schools taught not just history, but ethics, how to say no, how to listen, how to stand alone if needed. In New Chicago, a mural stretched across 3 city blocks, showing humans and Zin and Asthari building a bridge out of broken treaties. In Old San Diego, fishermen shared nets with amphibious traders from the Neymar expanse, swapping stories as they hauled in the day's catch. The Velnari and Qatari had not vanished. They still held power, still commanded fleets, still controlled vast resources, but their influence had shrunk. Their lies no longer went unchallenged. When they tried to push a new trade deal that favored only their allies, 12 minor species walked out of the meeting, just as humans had done. The phrase "walk like haze" had become a galactic idiom, meaning to choose principle over convenience. Carl Brooks, once the skeptic, now served as a liaison between the Compact and former Accord members. He traveled often, not in warships but in unarmed shuttles carrying only data pads and open ears. He had learned that real diplomacy wasn't about winning arguments but about creating space where truth could breathe. On one such trip, he met with a former Qatari general who had resigned after Orlan Prime. The general, old and weary, said simply, "You showed us we had forgotten how to be ashamed. That was a gift." On Viridia 9, Paul Dawson stood on the glacier's edge watching a new bio-barge lift off, this one built by human and Sathari hands together. It carried seeds, medicine, and teachers, bound for a world recovering from occupation. Kree, the young Sathari who had once shown Paul how to seal hulls with fungus, now led a team of hybrid engineers. They called themselves the Menders, those who fix what others break. Maria Lopez still taught on Luna Station, but her classroom now included students from 7 species. They learned math, science, and history, but also how to tell stories that heal instead of divide. One day, a Zin student pulsed a soft blue pattern during a lesson. Maria asked what it meant. The translator whispered, "It means thank you for seeing us." The Compact had no army. It had no capital. It had no laws written in stone. Instead, it ran on a simple rule. If you join, you speak plainly, act fairly, and stand with others who do the same. Violate that and you were not punished. You were simply no longer trusted. And in a galaxy that had grown tired of deception, that was consequence enough. Daniel rarely gave speeches anymore. But when he did, people listened, not because he held rank, but because he had proven again and again that his word matched his deed. On the anniversary of the walkout, he stood on the observation deck of the Aurora's Resolve, now retired from active duty and turned into a school for young diplomats. A student asked him what humanity's greatest weapon was. He looked out at the stars and said, "Our willingness to walk away." That night, as the ship drifted in quiet orbit, a message came through from the far edge of known space. It was from a species no one had heard of before, small, nomadic, living on solar sail vessels that danced between stars. They had heard stories of humans who valued truth. They asked only one question, "May we join you?" Lisa answered the next morning. "You don't need to join us," her reply read. "Just be true. That is enough." And so the Compact grew, not by conquest but by invitation, not by force but by example. Humanity never became the rulers of the galaxy. They never sought to be. Instead, they became something rarer, a people others could believe in. In the quiet corners of 1,000 worlds, children still told stories. Not of great battles or mighty fleets, but of the day humans walked away from a room full of lies and taught the stars how to speak the truth.